Rohan and the Rohirrim are one of the most central and important cultures of the Third Age, and play a huge role in the War of the Ring. But where do those people come from, and what is their history? Let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into Tolkien's lore and legendarium, as well as other great fantasy worlds. Welcome. By Middle-earth standards, Rohan is quite a young kingdom, being established in the year 2510 of the Third Age, so only 500 years or so before the events of the Lord of the Rings. The people who would become the Rohirrim are a much older culture than that, though. As far as we can tell, they were descended from the same ancestors as the Edain, who in the First Age stayed in the part of the map we think of as Middle-earth, while the Edain headed further west into Beleriand, fought against Morgoth in the War of Wrath, were rewarded with long lives and the island continent of Numenor. Then some of them returned to found the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor in Middle-earth. Those who remained became known as Northmen, dwelling in the plains of Rhovanion, between Greenwood the Great, later to be known as Mirkwood, and the River Running. Those of Númenórean descent viewed them as middle men, due to them not being high men, such as themselves, or low men, being those who succumbed to Morgoth's rule. In truth, these Northmen were quite a disparate group of different cultures, some of which stayed in those lands and whose descendants are now the peoples of Dale and Lake Towns, say. As the Third Age progressed, life was quite tough for those Northmen. There were Easterling raiders, orcs and goblins in the Misty Mountains, dragons to the north, and the terror of the kingdom of Angmar. Many found alliances with the kingdoms of Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south, which lasted over centuries. But eventually, the kingdom of Angmar fell, and one of the group of Northmen, who were known as the Eotheod, moved up from where they then were in the middle of the Anduin Valley into the area around the source of the River Anduin, north of Mirkwood, developing a culture rich in horsemanship. It was during this time that Eorl the Younger tamed the first Mearas horse of Rohan. That's where Shadowfax's lineage comes from. The Eotheod stayed in that area for perhaps 500 years, still cultivating their relationship with Gondor, their more powerful neighbour to the south. Gondor seems to have viewed this alliance as an important one too. Mordor was not yet the power it once was, and their sister nation Arnor had been destroyed in the north, so that may have seemed their most vulnerable border. The Eotheod were a useful early warning of and bulwark against evil forces approaching. In the year 2509 of the Third Age, however, it was Steward Cirion of Gondor who was calling out for help from the Eotheod, from the Belchoth, Easterlings who'd moved west into the lands of Rhovanion. Gondor called for aid, and the Eotheod responded. King Eorl set off south with the majority of his army, leaving just a token force at home to protect his own people, arriving just in time to a battle near the Field of Celebrant, just in time to help Steward Cirion to victory. By way of a reward, Cirion gave away the land we now know as Rohan to the Eotheod in perpetuity. This had once been a part of Gondor, but had been devastated and depopulated by war and the Great Plague. This was a generous gift, but also a solid political move by Gondor. It brought their strongest northern allies closer and protected them from attacks from the north and the west through what became known as the Gap of Rohan. The Eotheod loved the wide-open plains of their new land, all the better for their horse-based culture, and probably also appreciated having their own strong ally closer to hand. The Eotheod renamed themselves the Eorlingas in honour of the king who had secured this new home, and their new land the Riddermark, Land of the Knights, or simply the Mark. But in true Tolkien style it gained other names elsewhere. The Gondorians talked of the Rohirrim, the Horse Lords, and everyone started to use the Sindarin name for the land, Rohan. The deal was sealed with an oath of alliance over the tomb of Elendil and secured through a series of battles with the Dunlendings, who had attempted to colonise the land from the west, and the Easterlings, who had attacked from the east and north, as well as the occasional orc incursion. This wasn't an easy process. It took 3 generations before the borders of the land were secure, And even then, the western borders around Isengard weren't 100% secure. The Dunlendings continued to found settlements in the region, and locally intermarriage was often the only way to prevent hostilities. We'll come back to that in a moment, because that western border by the Fords of Isen was important. A new capital city was founded, Aldburg, in the foothills of the White Mountains, though this was soon moved to Edoras, and Rohan prospered. For 2.5 centuries, the first line of kings ruled, and the Rohirrim established themselves as a strong nation. The first line of kings are those immediately descended from Eorl. The second line of kings, as we'll see in a moment, followed on, but were not direct descendants. In The Lord of the Rings, this is shown rather starkly by their tombs, which line the road to Edoras. The first line of kings is on one side, the second line on the other. The first line of kings was to end with Helm Hammerhand, the 9th king. At the time of writing this video, it hasn't been released yet, but his story is due to be told in the War of the Rohirrim film. Basically, the Dunlendings were growing in strength once more, led by a man named Freka, who claimed ancestry from both the Dunlendings and the Rohirrim. He proposed a marriage between his son and Helm's daughter. Insults were thrown both ways, and Helm took Freka outside and one-punched him, killing him. Helm Hammerhand indeed. The Dunlendings, understandably, didn't take this very well, and returned a year later with an invading force, bolstered by some allies from the south. Helm retreated into the Suthburg fortress and held it through what became known as the Long Winter. His sons died, but he repeatedly raided the Dunlendings at nighttime, alone in the snow and the dark, until he too died, frozen as he stood. The winter eventually passed, and Helm's nephew Frialef led the remnants of the Rohirrim, as well as reinforcements from Gondor and elsewhere, to victory, reclaiming their land and founding the second line of kings. The fortress was renamed Helm's Deep in Helm's honour. When Saruman arrived out of nowhere, or the east, it seemed like a sensible decision, therefore, to give him the keys to Orthanc and let him worry about keeping the Dunlendings out of Rohan. He was the head of the White Council, so why not trust him? Over the next few hundred years, Rohan slowly regained its strength. There was quite a long period when orcs were a problem, forced south by the War of the Dwarves and the Orcs, but the bigger existential threat eventually came from Saruman himself. He had spent his time in Orthanc hunting for the ring and reinforcing Isengard. He had forged his own orc army and allied himself to the Dunlendings, who by now had a centuries-old grudge against the Rohirrim. As we come into the time of the War of the Ring, Saruman invaded. For some time he had been weakening King Theoden through his servant Grima Wormtongue, so Rohan wasn't prepared for the assault, which was brutal. The main force of the Rohirrim were defeated across 2 battles of the Fords of Isen, and Saruman's forces pushed into Rohan proper. Theoden, now restored by Gandalf, retreated to Helm's Deep to face the onslaught, while Gandalf rallied the scattered forces in the Westfold. We all know what happened next, and then in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. We saw the Rohirrim in all their glory, and we also saw the end of the second line of kings. After the ring was destroyed, Eomer inherited, but as he wasn't the direct descendant of Theoden, this created a new third line of kings. After that, we enter the 4th Age of Middle-earth, and our knowledge starts to dwindle. Eomer and Aragorn reaffirmed the centuries-old alliance between the two nations. Rohan grew in strength. Gimli headed up a party of dwarves to colonize the glittering caves behind the Hornburg, and that's pretty much all we know. Rohan can sometimes feel like a second-best nation, always troubled by their neighbours and in the shadow of Gondor's greater strength and plot relevance. But I don't think that's fair to them. The Rohirrim are not just support acts. They are the greatest horse lords in the world, taming even the mighty Miras. And perhaps even more importantly for Tolkien, they were a people of their word. They allied with Gondor, and when Gondor called for aid, they responded, not just with a token force, but with every soldier they could spare, even at the expense of their own safety. In the films, Theoden may have asked where Gondor was when the Westfold fell, But not in the books. The moment Theoden got the call for help, he responded, even though his nation was on its knees after Saruman's invasion, and he gave his own life defending his allies' city. And yet still, we call them by a name they don't call themselves. Rohan is a sort of debased version of the Sindarin Elvish for horse country. It's actually not about them at all, but their horses on which they built their culture. Their native name for their land is the Riddermark, the land of the knights. And I think that works so much better. Knights are about horses and honour sums up so much about the people of that land. They never forsook their honour or their friends. If you'd like to see more videos like this about Tolkien's deeper legendarium, there's a link appearing now on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link now to my Patreon on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.